"The board has decided we need a more forward-thinking approach to our financial leadership," said Jessica Winters, her voice carrying the practiced empathy of someone who delivered similar speeches before. She sat across from me in the corner office I'd occupied for the past 11 years as Chief Financial Officer of Lancaster Technologies. "We're bringing in Aidan McCall from Vertex Digital. He's got the innovative mindset we need for our next growth phase." I nodded, maintaining the composed expression I'd perfected through decades of high-stakes negotiations and market downturns. "You're too traditional, Thomas," she continued, leaning forward slightly. "Too old school. The markets are evolving faster than ever, and we need financial strategies that embrace risk rather than minimize it." Behind her carefully crafted explanation, the actual message was clear. At 58, I was being pushed aside for someone younger, flashier, and more aligned with Jessica's vision since she'd taken over as CEO 3 months earlier. I didn't argue or defend my track record, the consecutive years of profit growth, the strategic acquisitions that had transformed Lancaster from a regional player to a national force, the immaculate balance sheet that had weathered 2 economic downturns without a single quarter of losses. Instead, I simply asked, "What's the transition plan?" Jessica looked visibly relieved at my lack of resistance. 2 weeks. Generous severance, of course. The announcement goes out tomorrow morning." I nodded again, gathered my notebook and stood to leave. "I'll have everything prepared for Aidan," I said calmly. What I didn't tell her was that for the past 6 weeks, since she'd started sidelining me from key financial discussions, I had been methodically documenting a pattern of accounting discrepancies that suggested something far more troubling than different management philosophies. As the door closed behind me, I checked my watch. Exactly 43 days until those discrepancies would become impossible to conceal, no matter how innovative their financial approach. My name is Thomas Harrington, and until that day, I'd spent 23 years at Lancaster Technologies, the last 11 as CFO. I began my career in traditional accounting at Price Waterhouse in the late 1980s, built a solid foundation in corporate finance through the technology boom of the 1990s, and weathered the dot-com crash by adhering to financial principles that prioritized sustainable growth over speculative expansion. When I joined Lancaster in 2000, it was a promising mid-sized software company with strong products but financial inefficiencies that limited its potential. Over the years, I helped transform it into a $1.2 billion enterprise with diversified revenue streams and industry-leading profit margins. My philosophy was straightforward: understand the fundamentals, manage risk effectively, and maintain transparent reporting. These weren't revolutionary concepts, just the core tenets of sound financial management that had served me and Lancaster well for over 2 decades. My team respected this approach, and until recently, so had the board. The change began when our longtime CEO, Robert Lancaster, son of the founder, announced his retirement. After a 4-month search, the board selected Jessica Winters, a 42-year-old rising star who had made her name through aggressive expansion strategies at several technology companies. Her resume was impressive: double-digit growth figures, successful capital raises, and a reputation for disrupting traditional business models. From our first meeting, the philosophical differences between us were apparent. Jessica viewed my cautious approach to leverage and expansion as outdated. Where I saw prudent risk management, she saw missed opportunities. Her vision for Lancaster involved rapid scaling through acquisition, entering new markets quickly, and what she called creative financial engineering to accelerate growth. I tried to adapt, presenting more aggressive growth scenarios while still highlighting the underlying risks. But increasingly, I found myself excluded from strategic discussions. Jessica formed a future planning committee that notably omitted the CFO position. Board presentations that traditionally required my review were suddenly finalized without my input. The first serious red flag appeared 6 weeks before my termination. While reviewing quarterly reporting preparations, I noticed unusual entries in our European division's accounts. Revenues had been recognized months before our standard procedures allowed, and certain development costs had been capitalized rather than expensed, contradicting our established accounting policies. When I raised these issues with Jessica, she dismissed my concerns as excessive conservatism and said the new approach better reflected the economic reality of our business. I documented these discrepancies meticulously but discreetly, noting specific transactions, amounts, and departures from both our internal policies and GAAP standards. I wasn't building a case against Jessica, at least not initially. I was simply doing what I'd always done, maintaining accurate records and ensuring I could defend our financial statements if questioned. As these irregularities multiplied, a pattern emerged. The changes consistently inflated current quarter performance at the expense of future periods. None of the individual adjustments were egregious enough to trigger automatic alarms, but collectively they created a materially distorted picture of Lancaster's financial health. Most troublingly, they established commitments and expectations that would become increasingly difficult to satisfy in subsequent quarters. By my calculations, the cumulative effect would create a significant shortfall approximately 45 days after the close of the current quarter, right when the next quarterly results would be due. This timing aligned perfectly with my termination and the installation of a new CFO, who would presumably continue these innovative accounting approaches. The morning after being fired, I arrived at the office at my usual time, 6:30 a.m., well before most employees. I had 2 weeks to transition responsibilities, but more importantly, 2 weeks to decide how to handle the information I'd gathered. The easy path would be to hand everything over to Aidan McCall, my replacement, and walk away. The ethical path was less clear. I spent that day and the next organizing transition documents, meeting with my direct reports to explain the situation and reassuring them that Lancaster still had a bright future despite my departure. Many expressed shock and concern, but I emphasized professionalism throughout. Companies evolve, I told them. Sometimes that means leadership changes. By the third day, word of my termination had spread throughout the company. My phone and email filled with messages from colleagues, industry contacts, and a few board members I'd worked closely with over the years. One message particularly caught my attention, from William Chen, head of our audit committee and the longest-serving independent director on Lancaster's board. "Thomas, can we meet privately? Off-site, preferably. Some concerns I'd like to discuss." We arranged to meet that weekend at a quiet restaurant 30 miles outside the city, well away from anyone connected to Lancaster. William was already seated when I arrived, looking more troubled than I'd seen him in our 15 years of working together. "I voted against this," he said immediately after we ordered. "Your termination, 3 of us did, but Jessica had the rest of the board convinced that your conservative approach was holding back our growth potential." I nodded. "I assumed as much. It's her prerogative as CEO to build her team." William leaned forward. "That's not why I asked to meet. There are questions about some of the recent financial presentations. The projections seem overly optimistic. Some of the accounting treatments don't align with what you've advocated in the past." "When did you first notice these concerns?" I asked carefully. The last board package had several red flags. Revenue recognition seemed particularly aggressive, and the projected margins for next quarter exceed anything we've historically achieved. He paused. "Thomas, if there are issues I should know about as audit chair, now is the time to share them." This was the moment of decision I'd been contemplating since my termination. As a financial professional with decades of experience, I had ethical obligations that extended beyond my employment. But I also had practical considerations. Lancaster still held my unvested stock options, and my severance agreement contained standard non-disparagement clauses. "William, I documented some concerns before my departure," I said finally. "Accounting treatments that deviate from our established policies in ways that concern me." I outlined the pattern I'd observed, not offering conclusions about intent, simply presenting the factual discrepancies I'd identified. William listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions that reflected his own considerable financial expertise. "This is serious," he said when I finished. "If these practices continue and compound, we could face significant restatement issues, possibly even regulatory scrutiny." That's my assessment as well. What do you suggest? William asked. I can raise these issues with the audit committee, but without specific documentation. I have the documentation, I replied. But there are complications. My severance agreement includes confidentiality and non-disparagement provisions. If I formally submit this information, it could be viewed as violation. William considered this. What if I were to request it formally as audit chair, exercising my fiduciary duty? That would provide some protection. We discussed options for another hour, eventually developing an approach that would balance ethical obligations with practical considerations. William would call an audit committee meeting to review recent accounting policy changes, using his authority to request specific transaction records, the same ones I had already identified as problematic. This approach would initiate proper scrutiny without directly involving me in ways that might violate my separation agreement. If the committee identified the same concerns independently, they could take appropriate action. Upon returning home, I faced another decision: what to do with the next phase of my career. Several recruiters had already reached out with CFO opportunities at companies similar to Lancaster. The most attractive was from Meridian Systems, a direct competitor that had been trying to hire me for years. The Meridian offer was compelling: higher compensation, equity with shorter vesting periods, and a CEO who explicitly valued my conservative financial approach. But accepting it immediately after leaving Lancaster might appear vindictive, potentially complicating the developing situation with the accounting issues. I decided to delay any career decisions until the Lancaster situation resolved. Instead, I focused on completing a thorough professional transition. I met with Aidan McCall, my replacement, providing comprehensive briefings on our financial systems, team structure, and ongoing projects. I was cordial but careful, never mentioning my concerns about the accounting practices that Jessica had implemented. Aidan was 36, with an MBA from Stanford and a resume featuring several high-growth tech companies, though he'd never served as CFO before. He was clearly intelligent and ambitious, but lacked the experience to recognize many of the subtle issues I'd identified. "You've built an impressive operation here," he said during our final transition meeting. "But I'm excited to modernize some of these processes. Jessica has a bold vision for Lancaster." "Every leader brings their own approach," I replied neutrally. "I wish you both success." My last day at Lancaster was anticlimactic. A small gathering with my immediate team, a few handshakes, and a surprisingly warm email from Robert Lancaster, the former CEO, expressing gratitude for my years of service. By 5 p.m., I had turned in my badge, handed over my company devices, and walked out of the building that had been my professional home for over 2 decades. The following 2 weeks were unnervingly quiet. I took a long-planned vacation with my wife to our lake house, deliberately disconnecting from professional contacts and news. Upon returning, I found several messages from William Chen asking me to call him urgently. "The audit committee met yesterday," he said when I reached him. "Based on the areas you highlighted, we requested detailed transaction records for the European division and the new healthcare vertical. The initial findings are troubling, exactly what you predicted." "What happens next?" I asked. "We've engaged an independent accounting firm to conduct a focused review. Jessica is displeased, to put it mildly. She's characterizing this as an unnecessary distraction, driven by directors who don't understand modern financial management. Over the next 3 weeks, I maintained distance from the situation, focusing instead on long-delayed personal projects and preliminary conversations with executive recruiters." William provided occasional updates. The independent review was expanding in scope. The auditors had identified additional areas of concern. Jessica was becoming increasingly defensive in her interactions with the board. Then, exactly 42 days after my departure, my phone lit up with messages and calls from former colleagues. Lancaster's stock had plunged 31% following an unexpected press release. The company was delaying its quarterly earnings report due to an ongoing review of certain accounting matters and had placed its CEO, Jessica Winters, on administrative leave pending the outcome of that review. Within hours, financial news sites were reporting that Lancaster's board had uncovered potentially significant accounting irregularities related to revenue recognition, expense capitalization, and reserve calculations, precisely the issues I had documented. The stories mentioned a recent leadership change in the finance department, but didn't directly connect my departure to the developing scandal. The next morning, I received a call from Margaret Donovan, Lancaster's board chair. "Thomas, I'll be direct. We've made a serious mistake, both in accepting Jessica's accounting approaches and in removing you from your position. The independent review has revealed systemic issues that appear to have been implemented specifically to create the impression of stronger performance than reality justified." I listened without commenting, letting her continue. "The audit committee has informed us that you raised concerns about these exact issues before your departure. The board would like to discuss your potential return to Lancaster with expanded responsibilities and appropriate compensation adjustments." This was the vindication I hadn't sought, but couldn't deny feeling satisfaction about. However, my response wasn't driven by emotion, but by careful consideration of both personal and professional factors. "I appreciate the offer, Margaret. Before discussing any potential return, I'd need to understand the full extent of the issues identified, the board's plan to address them, and the specific role you envision for me. Lancaster has been an important part of my life for 23 years, and I care deeply about its future." We arranged a confidential meeting with the board's executive committee for the following day. In preparation, I reviewed my own documentation of the accounting issues, refreshed my understanding of regulatory requirements for financial restatements, and considered what conditions would be necessary for me to consider returning. The meeting was sobering. The independent review had identified accounting irregularities totaling approximately $42 million over the past 2 quarters. Not catastrophic for a company of Lancaster's size, but significant enough to require restatement of financial results and potentially trigger shareholder lawsuits. Jessica had been terminated for cause, and the board was preparing to notify the SEC of the issues. "We need someone who thoroughly understands our financial structure to help navigate this situation," Margaret explained. "Someone with credibility both internally and with external stakeholders. The board unanimously believes you're that person." The offer they presented was substantial. Reinstatement as CFO with a promotion to Executive Vice President, a significant compensation increase, accelerated vesting of my previously forfeited equity, and most importantly, a seat on the board of directors, providing the institutional authority to prevent similar situations in the future. I didn't accept immediately. Instead, I outlined specific conditions: complete authority to rebuild the finance organization as needed, direct oversight of all financial reporting and accounting policy, regular private sessions with the audit committee, and board approval for a comprehensive review of all financial practices implemented during Jessica's tenure. The board agreed to all conditions. 1 week later, exactly 6 weeks after my termination, I returned to Lancaster Technologies. The announcement triggered another stock movement, this time upward by 12% as the market reacted positively to the prospect of restored financial discipline. My first actions upon return were methodical and measured. I met individually with each member of the finance team, reassuring those who had maintained proper practices while identifying those who had been complicit in the problematic accounting. I established a dedicated team to work with the independent auditors on the restatement process. I implemented enhanced review procedures for all financial reporting to rebuild trust with investors and regulators. Most importantly, I initiated transparent communication with all stakeholders. Rather than attempting to minimize the issues, I ensured Lancaster acknowledged them fully, explained the corrective actions being taken, and established clear metrics by which our progress could be judged. The following quarters were challenging. We restated our financial results, took appropriate write-downs, and reset market expectations to realistic levels. Our stock experienced volatility, and we faced several shareholder lawsuits that eventually settled. But throughout this difficult period, we maintained our core business operations effectively and gradually rebuilt credibility with investors. Aidan McCall, my brief replacement, had resigned during the initial investigation. After the situation stabilized, I reached out to him privately. "The circumstances weren't fair to you," I told him. "You were placed in an impossible situation without the context to recognize the issues you were inheriting." "I should have asked more questions," he admitted. "I was so focused on proving myself and implementing Jessica's vision that I missed warning signs any experienced CFO would have recognized." "Experience is often earned through difficult lessons," I replied. "This doesn't define your career unless you allow it to." 1 year after my return, Lancaster had successfully navigated the accounting crisis. Our stock had recovered most of its losses. Our financial reporting was once again beyond reproach, and we had implemented governance changes to prevent similar issues in the future. The board appointed a new CEO, our former Chief Operating Officer, who valued transparent financial management and collaborative leadership. At our annual shareholder meeting, Margaret Donovan publicly acknowledged the board's error in my termination and credited my return for the company's successful recovery. "Sometimes organizations need to be reminded of their core values," she said. "Thomas Harrington embodies the integrity and financial discipline that have always been Lancaster's foundation." The new CEO called me traditional in his remarks that day, but he meant it as the highest compliment. "Traditional values like accuracy, transparency, and prudent risk management never go out of style," he told the assembled shareholders. "They're not constraints on growth. They're prerequisites for sustainable success." Looking back on this chapter of my career, I recognize that both Jessica and I had been partially right in our perspectives. Organizations do need to evolve and embrace appropriate innovation. But that evolution must be built on a foundation of sound principles and ethical practices. The tensions between growth and stability, between innovation and discipline, aren't conflicts to be resolved by choosing one over the other. They're polarities to be managed through thoughtful balance. The new CEO dismissed me as too traditional and fired me as CFO after 23 years with the company. 6 weeks after I left quietly, the accounting irregularities I had documented before my termination became impossible to conceal, leading to his removal, an SEC investigation, and my return, with expanded authority and a board seat. But the real victory wasn't personal vindication. It was the opportunity to reaffirm that integrity and financial discipline aren't outdated concepts. They're timeless principles that protect the long-term interests of every stakeholder in an organization's success. Traditional values, it turns out, never actually go out of style.